Okay, it's 3 minutes past the hour, so welcome to this webinar session this morning. ABA and IBM coming together to bring you discussion and demonstration on some real-world use cases for generative AI. Before we get going, I would like to pause and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. I am coming to you from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The challenge of AI, I guess, is interesting in that the conversation, I think, has changed over the last 6 months or so. Until about then, most of the discussion of AI was along the lines of it's this big transformative thing that's going to change everything we do, but we don't quite know how. Whereas more and more, the conversation today is shifting towards, okay, so AI is here. What are we actually going to do with it? What are the real world use cases? Where are we going to get benefits? How are we going to deploy it? And along that theme, I'm really happy to be working today with IBM to share some insights from their perspective on I guess the current status of AI technology and some of the thinking around governance, but probably most importantly to then start to explore what might AI do in the particularly complex business area of managing scams and fraud. And that area really brings to a fore some of the considerations about what is the appropriate role for a human versus an AI, and how do we make sure that they work together in a way that achieves the right outcomes for consumers, for businesses, and with an eye on regulatory expectations. So today, what we're going to do is firstly hear from Dr. David Goad from IBM, who will provide a presentation on some of his thoughts on that topic. We'll then be hearing from Zoe Banning, also from IBM. She will actually provide a demonstration of a prototype GenAI tool, or in fact tools that deal with different parts of the scam and fraud lifecycle, and sort of give you a feel for the direction in which some of these use cases are beginning to apply. Then the third part of our session will be a discussion involving both Dr. David and myself, together with two of the practitioners in this area of scams and fraud, Jocelyn Turner and Evelyn Hall. Jocelyn's from NAB and Evelyn from ANZ, and each has a key role in managing the customer complaint process, the scam compensation process, et cetera, et cetera. So, really be able to dig into some of the issues that deal with how this technology could be applied and some of the considerations. And finally, you'll get your chance, which will be some Q&A from you if we still have time for that. We should do. And to do that, you'll notice that there's a little Q&A icon up in the ribbon of your Teams window. Please just write your questions in there. And then we will pick those out and deal with them towards the end of the session. So that's the plan for today. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Hopefully we will all get some new insights that become useful guides for the utilization of AI in real world business uses. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. David Goad from IBM. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Nick. So let me share my screen here. Technology is always interesting. So you guys can see my screen and you can hear me okay? Everything's good?
We can,
okay.
Dave. Yep.
Awesome. So thanks, everyone. So yeah, really excited to be here today. My name is Dr. David Goad. I'll do a little bit of an introduction in a minute. So my topic today is to talk about generative AI with regards to scams compensation. Very topical. Both topics are actually, GenAI and scams are very topical. A lot of changes coming down the pipe, particularly in the banking sector over the course of the next year or two, and have been a lot of change over the last 6 to 12 months. So to me, they're both very interesting topics to go through. So, okay. So yeah, so a little bit of introduction about myself. So I'm Dr. David Goad. I'm the CTO for IBM Consulting here in Australia. I've been doing this a long time, over 20 years, worked for a lot of large organizations and also had a startup of my own for a period of time. I have a fairly extensive background in AI, and also in financial services industry. I've done a lot of projects in the financial services space and in banking over the years. I carry certifications in all the major cloud vendors and all the major AI technologies, including from a GenAI perspective. So my view, I like to think, is very practical. I've been involved in probably already something on the order of about 15 different GenAI pilots over the last 6 to 12 months, and have had a lot of, I guess, practical learnings from some of the challenges and mistakes that I've seen be made in terms of using the technology. I'm also what's referred to as a Microsoft Regional Director, which means that I'm one of a small group of people globally that Microsoft gets involved in terms of giving them feedback in terms of the technology before they release it out into the market. So that's me. In terms of the agenda for my little session, I'm going to try and keep it 20 minutes. It's going to be pretty quick. There's a fair amount of content to go through. I just want to talk very briefly about this whole concept of financial scams, some recent trends in digital banking and the scams process, and then really talk about the scams resolution process. I've got some interesting data from the IBM Institute of Business Value around the whole scams process and where people are experiencing some pain points. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what generative AI is, and how AI is changing dramatically, and how in the banking sector, not only will the adoption of AI increase significantly because of what GenAI is and because of this concept of a foundation model, but you're also going to be subject to a lot more regulation related to the use of AI over the course of the next 12 to 18 months as the government starts to release a lot more regulations in this space. And so I think from a banking sector perspective, you're going to see the adoption go up significantly, but you're also going to see the processes and systems that you need to put into place go up significantly as well. Then I'll talk a little bit about GenAI specifically and the scams process, and then that's going to lead into Zoe's demo, where Zoe's going to go through and show you some examples or use cases of using GenAI from a scams perspective. And hopefully you guys find this all interesting and useful. Okay, so banking and financial services scams. So very topical. I think a lot of you guys are here because of the Scam CSO Accord, right, which was a joint venture where the banks are trying to do a lot of different things to address this issue of scams and fraud. It's certainly become a big issue for a variety of reasons over the course of the last couple of years, principally because the adoption of online e-commerce has gone up astronomically, largely because it was moving quickly. We're getting people using online channels and electronic payment methods, but they didn't push even further when we had COVID, right? And people predominantly now, online is the predominant commercial channel, right? Most people will do a significant proportion of their buying online, and as a consequence of the online payment methods, usage has gone up significantly, and as a consequence of that, issues related to frauds and scams has gone up significantly as well. And this is a global problem. You can see some statistics here. I won't go through them in detail, but from just about every country in the world is having this issue, and the dollar figures are significant. If you bring it back to what's going on in Australia at the moment, recent statistics are that scams is well over a $3 billion industry. Okay, so big dollars involved. 80% increase in the losses from 2021 to 2022, so it's growing quite significantly. And the average loss per individual is going up significantly as well, so up by 54% to an average of about $20,000, which for a lot of Australians is a really huge impact for them from a savings perspective. So this is important. It is an important topic. It is impacting a lot of Australians. It's something that the banks are critical in terms of trying to address, and I think GenAI is a tool that will help you address that. If we look at scams as an industry, in terms of the different ways people are getting scammed, from a dollar figure perspective, things like investment scams tend to be the biggest ones, right? But if you actually look in terms of the volume, this concept of phishing, spear phishing is probably the most dominant one. This is where people are tricked. This is where people are tricked into thinking that the person at the other end of the text or the phone call or the email is actually the bank. Spear phishing is this idea that you're doing very targeted phishing, where you're using a lot of digital identity of the individual to make them believe that it's actually another individual at the other end of the phone. And these can be quite complex and quite mature processes where they will get a lot of information about you as an individual, which is really, really hard to deduce whether it is a fraudulent or scam email versus actually a true email or not. So phishing is probably one of the biggest ways that people are being scammed. If you look at the delivery modes or channels, depends on, you know, the number of reports versus the success, I guess, and the dollars lost. Um, I myself personally probably get a text every day from someone trying to scam me about something, right? You know, from one of the banks, we're having this transaction, or you need to click through here to, check something or whatever, right? So I get a lot of texts like that. Probably the more successful methodology in terms of scamming is by phone. People are becoming sensitized to that, but then again, the maturity of the scammers and their ability to provide very personalized information is going up as well. So you're getting a fair amount of money lost through that channel. And unfortunately for us, I think as a society, the people who are getting impacted the most by these scams is older individuals, retirees, people maybe not as tech savvy, people who, are probably a little bit more trusting when they get a phone call and they say it's coming from this particular bank, we need your information, or there's something going on. So this is, this very dramatic impact in terms of age here, in terms of it's our seniors, individuals across the society that are being impacted. So I talk about the fact that it's a big challenge. It's a growing challenge. I talk about the fact there's a lot of different ways people are being scammed. And we can talk about, when we talk about GenAI in a minute, and Zoe will talk about this in the demo, you can use it in terms of reducing false positives or actually identifying the scam activities. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the actual scam resolution process, okay? So whether the scam has been identified by the bank or the individual, how do you resolve this process? How do you give them a good customer experience all the way through? Because the reality of it is, if you look at a lot of statistics, they're not getting a good customer satisfaction. They're not getting a good process in terms of when they're having, an issue related to scams from the banks, right? A lot of common complaints that we hear from, customers, and again, this is statistical information collected by the IBM Institute of Business Value, things like, they're not happy with the refund amount, right? They couldn't get a status of their case. It was hard to find someone to actually get information about what was going on in terms of their case, right? They felt that they had to wait a long time to get a resolution for, the particular issue. Proactive, we talk about the scam safe accord, and the fact that the banks are trying to be more proactive in terms of stopping this activity, but then that's going to actually create more customer dissatisfaction because, I'm going to go to use my bank account, or I'm going to go to try and do something. It's going to be blocked by the bank. I'm going to go, well, why was that? No one talked to me. No one let me know what's going on. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of things that, people are going to get frustrated about this, right? And so, you get some statistics here in terms of the number of days to actually get a status, the number of chaser calls that people are doing, the amount of time it takes to actually complete the case and resolve it, whether people are happy or not about the actual resolution. There's a whole bunch of things that illustrate that the actual scams process itself needs a lot of work, not just actually preventing it as well, but preventing the scams, but also addressing the customer complaints and frustration as well. And so some of the things that, I think when we're looking at scams, operational KPIs, things about, how quickly have you actually resolved the issue? How quickly are you actually, and how effectively are you dealing with people on the phone or when they're communicating to you? And then just overall, what is their satisfaction with the process in terms of, they realize that you guys are helping them from a banking perspective. How satisfied are they that the banks are really, worried about them and trying to help them out through their process, right? Now, this is a diagram of a typical scams customer journey. I'm sure you guys all have slightly different processes and systems that you use. Zoe will be referring to this when she goes through to do her demo. There's a couple of sort of pain point areas, I would say, across this process, right? So you got everything from the automated detection of the scam potentially, or the banking customer calling in saying they have been scammed themselves, right? So they're calling in, they're frustrated, they're on an IVR system, they're emotionally charged, they might be waiting 30 to 60 minutes to get a response to their call, right? And then they're being passed through a number of different individuals who are collecting a bunch of information and expecting them to submit information, right? And then it takes time for the transaction to maybe be stopped or to be actioned in the short term. And then you're talking about quite a large amount of time it's taking for the actual overall case to be resolved. And this is for a lot of banks, still a fairly manual process and involves a lot of human intervention, a low degree of automation. So through some studies that IBM have done, we've identified a couple of what I would sort of say 3 key areas for opportunities for improvement from a scams process perspective. One is just pure reduction in the number of calls. If you can be more proactive in terms of giving your customers updates in terms of what's going on, giving them information, being more proactive every time the case has changed, letting them know what's going on, then you're going to get fewer phone calls. Fewer time spent on the phone, better customer satisfaction, right? The other thing is, obviously, there's a high volume of transactions. We talked about the sheer volume of these types of transactions that are going on. The more efficient that we can get, right? Again, better customer satisfaction, but also just more cost effective from a banking perspective. So there's a lot of opportunity there for efficiency. And then I think the last statistic where there's a lot of opportunities, just reduction of cycle time, being able to address these potential scams faster, addressing them both in the short term and the long term, resolving the case, which should reduce the impact of the scams, but also improve the customer satisfaction. So sort of three key areas: reduction in calls, increase in efficiency, and reduction in cycle time. And these are the things that Zoe will be talking about when she goes through and does her demo in terms of benefits that you would get from generative AI. So that's the scams process. Now let me talk a little bit about generative AI in banking. AI has been around a long time. A lot of the banks are doing a lot of work related to AI, and it's been in the news a lot, right? However, there is a fundamental change that's happened in terms of this concept of AI over the course of the last 12 to 18 months. And it had to do with a research paper back in 2018 called Attenuation. It was All You Can Need. It was written by Google and actually the University of Toronto. I'm Canadian, by the way, so I'll wave the flag for Canada, right? And what they did was they came up with a new mathematical way of actually building really, really large AI models, okay? Now I'll come back to it in a minute why that's important. So in traditional AI, every time you had a specific use case, you had to build a custom model for every use case. So if you were a bank, you had to, whether it was object detection, sentiment analysis, doing an analysis or forecasting or whatever, you had to build an individual model for every single use case. And that was expensive. And you had to manage those models going forward. Well, with this idea of the foundation model, so everyone talks about generative AI, but to me, the really interesting part of this evolution of AI over the last 3 or 4 years is this concept of the foundation model. You have this idea of a build once, use many times approach, right? So you can build these really big models. Again, came back from this paper, like I said, in 2018. And because these models are really big and based on a lot of data, they can do a lot of different things. So build once, use many times. Right. The analogy I use is you used to have to build your house every time you wanted to move in. Now these days you can buy a house, you can buy it from someone else, you can move in, you can renovate, right? You can put a little bit of stuff on the wall or whatever, some pictures or whatever, but you don't have to build it from scratch. You can buy it from someone else. Now, if you extend my analogy of the buying a house, is very similar to this concept of a foundation model, right? The advantage you have when you go and buy your house right now is the fact that it's regulated. There are building codes and standards that the house is built to. You can actually get someone who will certify that your house was built to those standards. You know what I mean? And you can come in and get people to inspect against that. The challenge you have right now in terms of generative AI and this concept of the foundation models right now is that it is unregulated. It's a self-regulated industry, and herein it becomes the challenge, right? So you don't know necessarily what you're getting when you buy this AI model off the rack, okay, as it were. So this concept of foundation models really transformative for the AI industry. On the one hand, it creates a lot of benefits because you have this build once, use many times approach. You can buy models from other people. You don't have to have a separate model for every single use case, which means huge economies from an AI perspective, and therefore increased use of AI. But then there are a lot of risks because of the fact that you're buying something that someone else has built, okay? So that's the concept of foundation model. And there's this idea of what you refer to as generative AI. So this is anytime you're using AI to generate content. Then you guys have probably heard the term large language models. This is a form of foundational generative AI that's focused on text generation. And then I'm pretty sure that most of the people who are on the call would have played or had a chance to play with something called ChatGPT, which is a large language model, which is a form of foundational generative AI. Okay, so those are sort of definitional. Now, a few things about what GenAI is, what foundational generative AI is, what it can and can't do, okay? So it's really good at generating text, images, and codes. Very fluent. When you go up and use ChatGPT, it's very fluent in terms of its responses. It's very human-like, which is great. One of the challenges is that people tend to interpret that fluency as an indication of accuracy, which is not necessarily the case, right? It will provide you with information, but not necessarily facts. One of the challenges we have with generative AI and these foundation models is they have this concept of what they call hallucinating, where they make things up. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. And they can create very novel content. So there's a lot of interesting use cases. And as a consequence of that, the uses of generative AI have exploded, particularly in the banking industry. A couple of things were found that generative AI is it's not intelligent. Again, people tend to interpret fluency in language as being intelligence, which is not the case. It's simply a machine that's really good at taking the last 100 words and predicting the next 100 words. It's not deterministic. These are probabilistic and stochastic tools, which means that like human beings, they will get it wrong. So when you're building AI processes, you always have to assume that some small percentage of the time, even if you have a really good process, the machine will come to the wrong decision. Now, one would argue that the machine's going to do it faster and more accurate than the human being probably will, but it will still make mistakes. And as a consequence of that, you have to build your business processes around that. And it's not intentional. Again, these tool sets are not what I call intelligent, and they're not thinking through. That all being said, the banking industry is probably the poster child for the adoption of generative AI. And I'll talk about all the banks. I'm sure every bank that's on, everyone who's on the call right now can cite investment programs that are going on in your bank related to generative AI. This largely has to do with the efficiencies that have been identified out of this new generative AI with these concept of foundation models, but also the fact that banks are a poster child for the use of AI and GenAI in general, right? Client-facing workforce, regulatory environment that's very text-intensive, sustained digitization, very white-collar industry. So the benefits in terms of GenAI that have been quoted by a lot of the analysts are quite significant, and therefore you're seeing a lot of adoption. So much so that as a technology, ChatGPT and GenAI in general has been adopted faster than any other technology ever, in the last 20 years, faster than the mobile phone, faster than the internet, faster than Facebook. So you're getting a technology that's being adopted by everyone very quickly. However, and this is what we'll talk about a little bit about later on, the regulatory environment is rushing to catch up in terms of addressing all the risks and issues associated with the use of generative AI, just because the technology's moved it very quickly. If you're looking for typical use cases in terms of where banks are using generative AI, you can go to Gartner. They have these really good tools called use case prisms, where what they've done is they've evaluated GenAI in terms of the potential use cases and the value to the organization versus the feasibility. You can see that up here, fraud and scam detection is top 10 in terms of the use cases. There's a lot of other use cases that Gartner's identified from a GenAI perspective, particularly around the customer service area. As I said, you guys already know this because you're already investing in this, right? There's significant investment programs going on across all the banks related to generative AI. And all the vendors are making huge investments. So for example, Microsoft recently announced they're investing $5 billion just to build cloud infrastructure in Australia to support the whole AI. So this is not a fad, right? This is not, it's interesting and it's going to go away and there'll be something else. People are not going to invest this kind of money in this technology. They didn't think it's going to be transformative from a variety of perspectives. GenAI does have its challenges, this issue of bias. When you first used to use ChatGPT and you asked it what were the top 10 authors, it would come up with top 10 male authors. You'd had to ask it specifically, include men and women. It does have a tendency to hallucinate. I don't like the term hallucination because it implies a humanistic quality to the machines. It's not the case. What it simply means is that these machines, because they're stochastic, if they don't have the right information, they'll still come back with an answer, even if it's the wrong answer. And particularly if the models were trained on bad data, then they'll come back with bad answers, right? ChatGPT was very known for doing a lot of hallucination when it first came out because it was trained on the internet. And do you believe what you find on the internet? No, probably 30 to 40% of what you find on the internet is garbage. And so, of course, it would come back with a lot of, it would sound really, really fluent, but the answers were actually completely wrong. GenAI in and of itself represents another security issue. And there's I could talk for days about the whole issues related to security in GenAI, which I won't. And it has raised a lot of ethical concerns about how people are using it. Now let's focus down very specifically in terms of GenAI and large language models for banking for scams. So if you look at this is this process that we were talking about a little bit earlier, the scam detection process that I went through. And I said to you that there was opportunities for reduction in terms of the number of calls. There was opportunities for automation in terms of efficiency gains, right? And we also said there was opportunities in terms of just reducing the overall cycle time of the process, right? And so we mapped out all these different areas where we think there's opportunities. What Zoe is going to go through with her demo is to talk through a whole bunch of different example use cases across this process of where you can use generative AI to improve the process, right? Everything from identifying the actual fraudulent transaction in the first place, reducing the number of false positives, to managing the inbound communication that's coming from the customer, understanding their sentiment if they're very upset, then pushing them through a different channel, making sure that this particular case or request is going to the right people in the organization. So actually an assignment of the case to the right people in the organization, doing an assessment, actually coming back with a view in terms of whether the scam case should be, processed favorably in terms of the customer or not, helping out with the investigation. I won't go through all these in detail, but there's a whole bunch of different opportunities here where you could use generative AI to improve this process, to reduce the cycle time, to improve the efficiency, and to ultimately just increase the customer's net promoter score and their customer satisfaction. Okay, so that's the end of my little session. I kind of went a bit quickly, but I wanted to get through the content because I think the cool bit is when Zoe actually show you her tech. So I'll turn it over to Zoe now.
Great.
Yeah, Dave, let me just share my screen. All right, just checking that you can see my screen and you can see the user journey map. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Zoe.
Awesome. All right, hey everyone, my name is Zoe Banning. I'm a GenAI consultant from IBM, focused on the financial services industry. And like Dave, I've also been involved in a lot of GenAI projects over the past year. But today I'm really excited to demonstrate how GenAI can transform the scam customer service experience. But just quickly before I get started, if you do have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them after the demo or at the end. Otherwise, maybe you could drop your questions into the Q&A function, and Dave might be able to moderate as well. All right, let's get started. So I've built this app specifically for today's demonstration, which is powered by IBM's What's Next.ai technology in the backend, which will really just help me use different models, parameters, and prompts depending on the use cases I select. So what you're seeing in the middle of my screen is the scam customer journey that Dave spoke to throughout his presentation. And what I plan to do now is take you through a couple of the GenAI use cases listed on the right-hand side of my screen here. So let's get started, and we'll choose use case number 2. This use case will use GenAI to quickly condense this detailed customer complaint you see on the right-hand side of my screen about an investment scam, and create a short paragraph summarizing this text. Also, if you're interested, on the left-hand side of my screen, it will update with the details about the prompt that I'm using, as well as the model parameters. So when I click on the different use cases, this should be updated. But I'm just presenting this to show you that there are different prompt techniques and levers that we can pull throughout the design process, really showcasing that I've chosen different models and prompts and parameters based on the use case. So let's get started. I will copy and paste the customer complaint into the chat interface below. And now this is a live demo, so we will have to wait a few moments for it to generate. But what I can say is happening in the back end is that the email is being read by the large language model and a response is being generated. So leveraging this tech will really help the customer service agents to quickly understand the crux of the issue without the need to sift through the entire email. So there we go. We've got a really short summary of the really detailed customer complaint that we received, which will really help the customer service agents quickly read through and understand the complaint. Now let's move into the next use case, number 3, which is categorization. So I'll click on that one. So I'm going to give the large language model a prompt for which it is going to evaluate and categorize the complaint. So it's updated the prompt on the left-hand side of the screen. I'll drop in the customer complaint again. And categorizing the complaint can really help to swiftly direct the complaint to the right team, as well as the right department to investigate. So what we've seen here is it's categorized the complaint as a fraud and scam, and it's also generated a short explanation. I think it's also worth noting that for this demo, I have added in this chat interface. However, this use case may be more impactful if we turn it into a system-to-system platform, which could take out the manual process of copy and pasting in the email each time. Whereas in a system-to-system platform, it could run multiple of these prompts in one go. I just thought I'd have the chat interface here for the demo for just the ease of use. Now we'll click on use case 5, which is evaluating tone and sentiment. So I'll give the large language a prompt for which it's going to evaluate the tone and the sentiment of the customer complaint, and then categorize it as a positive, neutral, or negative sentiment. It will also provide a brief explanation of this classification. So let's drop in the customer complaint again, and we'll wait for it to generate the response. You also notice on the left-hand side, the prompt that I'm using and the parameters are being updated. All right, there we go. So the GenAI has evaluated this complaint and rated it a 5 out of 5 impact. So I think it's extremely urgent, meaning it should be prioritized to be investigated as soon as possible. Finally, I think I've got some time to go through a few more actually. So number 7 here is about assessing the urgency and impact. So what I'm going to do is ask the large language model to predict potential financial and reputational impacts on a scale of 1 to 5. This will really help the customer service agent prioritize a complaint based on these insights. So let me go ahead and copy and paste the customer complaint in again, and we'll wait for it to come up with a score. All right, so we've got a rating of 5 out of 5. So it's extremely urgent and needs to be prioritized. Finally, let's finish the demo with creating an email to go back to the customer. So this will really help confirm to the customer that there's been some sort of movement from the bank. They've recognized that they've got the complaint. They're going to outline the steps being taken and provide an estimated timeline for resolution. So for the last time, let's drop in the customer complaint and we'll wait for the response. It might also be worth mentioning that there's a lot of different techniques that we can use to write the prompt. For this one, we've used a zero-shot prompt and an instruction prompt. But I think it's really cool to see that, like, writing the prompts, it's really a science and an art with crafting these. And depending on how you craft them is will help with generating the response. So we've got the email response here, and it's pulled out the name of the client. It's kind of acknowledging that there's a receipt of the email, that the complaint is being investigated, and what the bank is going to do as a next step. So in conclusion, integrating GenAI into the customer journey not only it expedites the resolution process, but it also enhances the customer's trust and satisfaction by ensuring that their concerns are addressed promptly. So that's the end of my demo. Nick, I'm not sure if there's any questions that have come up throughout. Otherwise, myself and Dave are happy to answer them at the end of the call or take it offline. But over to you.
Thank you, Zoe. We might hold the questions for a little bit. At the moment, the only official question is a request for a copy of the slides, which I can confirm that not only will the slides be available, but a recording of the webinar as well. So on that, we're good. So what we're going to do now is actually, and first of all, thank you both to Dave and Zoe. Dave, it's great to be able to talk about it and bring your expertise, and Zoe actually seeing it in action. At least for people like me, helps a lot because I'm a visual thinker, and when I actually see something, I probably respond to it a bit more clearly. So that's really helpful. What I'd like to do is open up the conversation about some of the implications of this technology and how to utilize it in a business sense. So in addition to Dave and Zoe, we'll bring in Jocelyn Turner from NAB and Evelyn Halls from ANZ. Jocelyn, I might start with you. Firstly, just if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself and explain your role at NAB. But then perhaps looking at the long list of potential opportunities for AI deployment in this space, which ones strike you as sort of the low-hanging fruit, if there is such, and the first candidates, I guess, that you'd be looking at potentially to deploy?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invite. My name is Jocelyn Turner. I am at NAB. My title is Executive for Customer Resolution and Remediation, which basically means that I have the privilege of working with customers across all aspects of the journey where things go wrong for them. So either at individual customer level or right through to large customer cohorts. So I do, from that perspective, get to see many situations where things don't work. We are already looking at GenAI as well as being from a couple of aspects. The first one that we will actually that we're starting to work with is classification of complaints. That is something that I'm really keen to get better at. Obviously, we can't improve the experience for customers unless we get that insight really quickly to the people who can help. So that's number one. The other reason we've chosen that one is because we already have that sitting in kind of so I'm not a techie person. Inside the technology architecture that we require to be able to get the data out and get it into GenAI. So from a perspective of being able to technically get into that data, we can do that quite quickly. I think the second most important thing for us is going to be around that brilliant example that Zoe gave of how you capture the complaint. One of the things that we all see is the quality breakdown that happens between the customer interaction and then the way that's recorded in our complaint system. It's really hard for our people to be able to translate that easily. So that's going to be the next big thing for us, is how do you improve the quality of what's in complaints by using the translation layer through capturing what customers say and translating it straight into a complaint.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I might depart from script a little bit here, because something you just said is resonating with me in terms of a current conversation. So the ASIC chairman, Joe Longo, came out yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, and he said that some of the experiments that ASIC has conducted recently suggest that AI is good at providing a summary of text along the lines of what you were just describing, but not particularly good at capturing nuance. Now that may be because ASIC likes to write in a way that you need a lot of nuance to interpret what they're actually trying to say. I'm not sure. If you try to thinking about that, what does that mean if you operationalize this, that ability to provide the high level summary versus really get to grips with nuance? If you think, just going back to your point about the summarization part.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. So we haven't done, I can't comment on whether or not that's true, because I'm not far enough into our work to know. But certainly if we couldn't capture nuance, that would be a problem, because you do want to understand not just the facts of it, but you would also want to understand the customer sentiment and kind of the criticality for a customer, because the words might sound the same, but for different customers, the tone will give you a different sense of criticality. Certainly what we're looking at the same time would be to try and overlay sentiment analysis over the top of it, so that you don't just get the words, but you also get the sentiment. But I can't comment enough about how well we're going to do that, because I don't know yet, because we're still working on it. But I would absolutely agree with him that that would be a significant problem, because the real gold is in what does it mean to that specific customer, and what is the impact that situation is having on them.
Great. And then Zoe did show us the sentiment piece as well, so perhaps it's about bringing some of these together. Evelyn, again, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself first of all and your role at ANZ. I guess the question I'd like to start you off with is, okay, what's the hard stuff that's really worth trying to get through to? What's the end of this journey in your point of view?
Sure. Yeah, and Thanks. Interesting conversation, everyone. So my role at ANZ is Customer Fairness Advisor. It's a broad role reporting to the CEO, dealing with a range of customer fairness issues across the bank. I am involved in some of the really complex and high-value scam complaints, as well as being involved in some of the policy and regulatory reform discussions through ABA and Treasury. Prior to coming to ANZ, I was the lead ombudsman for banking and finance at AFCA, so dealt with scam complaints from a different perspective from the EDR scheme, trying to resolve those complaints. In terms of your question, I think, the diagram Zoe showed was quite helpful because it really shows that there's a number of points along the scam complaint process or the scam engagement process. And at each of those points, there's potential for AI to play a role, whether you go from that initial kind of summarize to then a categorize to a triage. And I've seen someone in the chat call out vulnerability, and that is something where, you can prime it to actually be able to identify vulnerability, and it has something that various banks have used in the hardship space. So even if people may not be saying the obvious words, you can tell from the different speech patterns or other words phrasing that they use that they're actually vulnerable. I think there are challenges even at those early stages. Obviously the value increases as you get further up the chain, and you're dealing with the volumes, but also you're dealing with high level of expertise. There's huge potential, but there's also challenges. And even at the start, it's quite interesting. There's an initial challenge if you're, for example, trying to categorize from customer language, because even customers will not distinguish between a fraud and scam, whereas those words have quite distinct meanings under the current regulatory framework, the payments code, etc., and potentially into the future as well in terms of the response, the investigation, the reimbursement, etc. So there are some challenges around that. I mean, maybe you don't take the customer headline, you take some of the further explanation, where once they start talking about it was an investment scam and I sent my money myself, that starts to help you identify. But I think it would require, a deeper dive than perhaps might appear. Equally, I think in terms of, assessing things like urgency and criticality, the sad fact of the matter is that for every customer who's been scammed, it is hugely important, hugely urgent, and very impactful. So I think if you just went from customer language and emotion almost, you would probably not be able to distinguish as readily, as you might actually need to, in terms of, obviously $1 million loss is hugely significant, or an account that's still active and maybe currently being scammed is something that needs to be actioned quickly. But very few customers are going to say, I've been scammed, but it's okay to wait a few days before you look into that. So it's interesting that even at the early stages there are some challenges, but also, as I said, massive potential.
Great, thank you. I guess one of the interesting questions that sort of underpins both of that, and I'll bring you in a moment, Dave, but back to you, Jocelyn, to start with. As you start to think about the process to consider deploying some of these solutions, what sort of management guardrails, governance process do you see as appropriate to make sure you're making the right decision in terms of prioritizing your investment, checking along the way that it's actually going to do what it's supposed to do, and then even when it's in production, how are you going to make sure that this wonderful tool is actually not going to get you in trouble with the regulator?
So we have a really rigorous process that we go through, and NAB, like everybody else, is learning about how we use GenAI, but certainly we don't have an idea and deploy into the wild. I think that's probably the first thing I would say. We go through a really rigorous process of, we have to run basically a proof of concept first to try and work out at a small scale whether or not we think it works. We validate that back against the work that you would do at a manually. So we kind of do, so that's why we're using a sort of small scale to begin with. So we fully manually validate to make sure you get the same outcomes. We then sort of build the scale up and start to industrialize into a pilot. And then once we're kind of happy that the pilot is working at a more industrial level, it's only at that point that you would start to deploy. So by the time we are using it in its truest form, it will have been through a number of stages of testing. And then through each stage, you are validating it in different ways to make sure you're happy with it. But what we will always do and are already thinking about is, regardless, we will always have somebody who is testing and validating the models, so that we'll be doing random sampling, we'll be making sure the models are working, and we'll be validating all the way through just to see if we need to retrain, because it's certainly not something that we plan to just put out, set and forget and let run forever, because we need to be always sure that the models are working.
Mm-hmm. Just to bring a bit of balance to that last point, could you elaborate a little bit on the current process you have to try to make sure that the output of the people who are doing this today is consistent? Because that's also a huge challenge, right?
And to be honest, it's effectively the same thing, because we have a QA process that sits over the top of the work that our people do. One of the things that we certainly have the, well, I'm going to call it the privilege of, is my team is does the central classification and then sends it out to the organization. And every part of the business does test whether or not our classification is accurate, to just make sure that they're getting the right complaints. So we get plenty of feedback all of the time about the quality of our models. And so that's, but that will continue to happen. So I will always, in fairness, I will always continue to encourage that, because it is important that every part of the business is reading the complaints that are appropriate to them. And they will always give me feedback if they don't think that the complaint is right, accurate, or should be allocated into their category.
Yeah, that seems quite fair. Dave, can I bring you in on this one? ISO standard 42001 recently announced. Lots of deep, what's the word? Thick prose in there. Is it a helpful model to inform people like Jocelyn and Evelyn as they build out these things? Is there a simpler approach that we should be adopting? What's your thoughts on sort of governance for AI deployment?
Governance and regulation in AI is an interesting one. I'll introduce a term or a theme, and that's agile. Right? Maybe something that's foreign from a banking perspective. The reason why I say that is, yeah, I mean, absolutely, that 42001 can be useful, but the challenge we have at the moment is this is a deeply and quickly changing field. Okay, the technology we're talking about really only started being commercially deployed about 18 months ago. But more importantly, the regulatory environment is changing dramatically. I would argue that in Australia at the moment, we're largely, when it comes to AI, in an unregulated environment. Okay, there's some sort of broad-based regulations that touch on the issues, but there's no specific regulations specifically related to AI. And this is not just an Australia thing, this is a global thing. So what you've seen is that, for example, in the US, Biden came out with an executive order back in October, November, about using AI and mandating that all the regulatory agencies in the US had to start regulations, increased regulations related to AI. The EU just came out with their own AI regulation, which took a risk-based approach, right? And what was interesting about that regulation is the fines, 7% of global revenue. So the EU, in typical fashion, just like with the GDPR, are backing up their regulations with very, very hefty fines if people don't comply. The challenge you have in Australia, like I said, has been largely unregulated. The government came up with a white paper in January, which talked about the need to put more regulation from an AI perspective in. Okay. And in that white paper, they identified that there would be over 11 different pieces of regulation that would have to be updated based on their assessment of the impact of artificial intelligence and its increasing use, particularly around a GenAI perspective. There was also an interesting white paper that came out from the Australian Signals Directorate, where they identified the security issues related to AI and went through a whole laundry list of things as well. So the problem that the banks have and organizations in general have in Australia is that it's a changing environment, right? The regulations will be changing over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. It's very, very hard to predict exactly which way the government is going. It looks like they're going to be using that same risk-based approach as what you're seeing in the EU. But the actual details about how they're going to execute against these sort of broad-based principles, is yet to be defined. So from a banking perspective, I think I would go back to basics, very simple basics. Do you have a process for identifying all the uses of AI in your business? The banks would say yes, but I would challenge them on that, because a lot of the software vendors now are bringing in AI and they're actually just implementing into their tool set without even talking to their customers if it's a SaaS product. So I think you would find that if you went back and did a full audit of your processes, that you're actually using AI more than you think, right? So do you have a process for actually identifying where you're using AI? Do you have a process for actually using a bit of a risk-based approach and having some sort of governance processes and models to manage when you're using AI and how people are going to use it? I think those are the basics that you would have to start to look at, having a list, managing that list, and have some governance processes. And I probably finished on the last point. This is not a technology problem. This is a business problem. If you think that it's going to be your CTO or your CIO's responsibility to ensure that you're going to apply to the regulation and it's their challenge, you're making a big mistake. Inevitably, at the end of the day, if you use these technologies, which you'll have to because your competition is to be more efficient, right? If you use them badly and you have a brand impact because people found out that you were using AI and it did the wrong thing to people, right? It's not going to be the CIO and the CTO that are going to be standing up in front of the press conference explaining. It's going to be the CEO. And so my point here is that you need to have governance methods that include the business, that have senior management involved in these processes, and that they understand that, because at the end of the day, they're going to carry the responsibility for it. A lot of these regulations that are coming in will hold senior executives accountable personally, liability perspective, for their use of AI in their organization. So as a senior executive, whether you're CEO of a bank or whatever, you need to be taking more of a personal interest in terms of how people are using these technologies. Anyways, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you, Dave. Just a couple of observations before I turn to you, Evelyn. Firstly, this point about maybe people are using it more than you think. Certainly the fact that ChatGPT is available fairly easily, even on people's phones, means that perhaps some staff are even tempted to go outside formal process at the moment and drop in a letter into the ChatGPT and see what it says, and maybe that's already a challenge. On your observation about the European regulation, I've heard people say that they are either, perhaps like GDPR, setting a global standard that everyone's going to have to adhere to and will be sort of a de facto way of channeling investment. Alternatively, some people will be of the view that they're going to strangle AI innovation in the cradle by being a little bit too tight. Before I go to you, even Dave, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, there is a certain amount of angst in the industry around this. When the EU came out with that regulation, there was 100 senior executives across a variety of industries that wrote an open letter to the EU stating that they were extremely concerned about this regulation because it would stifle innovation. And a lot of their concern was around the fact that the regulation, that it governs the EU, but it doesn't govern other countries. So people are talking about this idea now that if you put too much regulation in, right, then it's actually going to cause a sort of an innovation gap between countries that are less regulated, that really don't care, and other countries that are more concerned about this, right? So there is a lot of concerns in the industry about that. Look, I think in Australia, they're taking a broad-based approach. They're consulting broadly, which is good. But and I think they will. They are talking to the banks, so they're trying to get people's input in terms of how they're going to form these regulations. But yeah, it will be a fine line between stifling innovation versus making sure the public is protected. But they are going to have to do something, because this is, if you go ask the general public, do they think there should be more regulation governing the use of automation and AI? They would say yes, right? It's just, they wouldn't even question it. So it's something that governments will have to do in response to public demand, right? So.
Thank you. Evelyn, I know you can't speak for your former employer, but perhaps thinking from the perspective of a regulator, we've heard both ASIC and APRA come out publicly saying, well, actually, there are regulations that apply to AI, and that's the law that it is today, right? So whatever AI deployment there is, you need to make sure that it is conforming to current law. As Dave's pointed out, there's a discussion about whether supplementary regulation is required specifically for this technology. AFCA, other regulators, how do you think they're currently contemplating this challenge?
Yeah, I think the statements from APRA yesterday were particularly interesting. which really touched on a few of the things that Jocelyn mentioned, which is that, and I saw this reported in completely the opposite sense in the AFR and the Australian today, which I thought was amusing. One said that basically APRA was good to go and happy with the use of AI. The other said APRA, issued a severe warning. So I don't know how ChatGPT would have interpreted those emotional nuances in APRA's speech, but anyway, but really, reading the speech, what they were saying was that it is appropriate to start investigating AI and the potential, provided that you have appropriate governance and risk management. Is similar to what you would do with any other form of tool or process that you are considering adopting. I think it's also interesting in banking to remember that in some senses, these concepts are not as new to us as perhaps other, elements of machine learning in there, as well as in the scam prevention and detection area, which continues to get more sophisticated. We have been using the initial stages of this kind of technology for some time. And I think the other helpful thing about the regulators, I do think, Australia has traditionally adopted quite a technology neutral approach, which again, I think is helpful because it really looks to the substance of what is being done and the risk that presents and the potential harm rather than the mechanism through which it's being affected. So again, we had these discussions, with ASIC around responsible lending in terms of, are you concerned about how you do it or what you do and what's the overlap there? And they, again, have been quite clear that, where possible, they will try to adopt a technology neutral stance, although they do naturally have an awareness of the risks that, may be inherent, certainly in technologies that have really broad and widespread application. I think one positive as well is that we know, right, that ASIC and APRA and AFCA themselves are actually investigating the use of AI tech as well, because like banks, they have to consume, process and draw insights from large amounts of information. So there is a sense that perhaps, we can go up the learning curve together. And I think that is helpful, for industry to engage with regulators constructively and to make sure that there is a good understanding of what it is that's being done and how that's being approached, particularly with kind of, as we go into the newer areas. The other piece, which I think Dave touched on, is the customer and the consumer, because it's actually really important to bring them up the learning curve as well, because as you mentioned, there's a whole trust issue. And my sort of, what always sits in my mind is, there'll be a point at which customers really understand, or it becomes apparent, what particular industries or what particular players are doing with their data and what they may be showing or not showing and how that is impacting the customer experience. And I think the worst situation you can have is for customers to become aware down the track and then to realize that actually they're not comfortable with that. So I think it has to be sort of a process that we go through as a society to make sure that everyone understands the guardrails and also that they are consistent with community expectations.
I do wonder whether regulators will want some level of visibility of the way the AI has been trained and instructed. They do today have power to look at policies and processes in regulated entities. Is that the parallel?
Oh, absolutely. And you can't understand how something works, if you don't know how it works. So I think, that is critical. And, in my previous role, I did have conversations with various mainly startups or fintechs who were looking into, these kinds of things. And certainly, I can't imagine that anyone could tell either a regulator or, in fact, their board, we threw this data into a model and this answer came out, but we can't really tell you how or why or, so there is a question then as to how people get comfortable, again, whether regulated, whether through governance processes, whether the community, there is a certain level of comfort required, and that goes to, standard AI principles such as explainability, transparency, etc. And I think, you know, looking across a number of the global standards that have been put in place around those concepts, I think there is a reasonable level of agreement around what are the key aspects and what are the key guardrails that responsible AI use should entail.
Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. What I'd like to do now is actually focus in on what's potentially a very tricky but maybe really valuable use case. And the question I'll pose to all three of you, in the whole debate about scams compensation, you know, we're seeing a move towards the government imposing mandatory codes on multiple industry sectors where you know, all industry sectors will be expected to meet a minimum minimum set of customer protective obligations. Exactly how they'll fit together across those sectors is a little bit unclear at the moment. And you know, the government's indicated that where institutions fail to meet those standards, it's likely to at least create a presumption that compensation would be payable. It's sort of tricky because you've got this problem of how would you actually go about, or would you trust an AI to actually assess this complex set of circumstances across multiple players, not just your own institution, but other institutions? Think about the body of precedent that your organization's had, the body of precedent that the regulator may or may not have established. What are the actual laws? And could an AI actually try to anticipate the outcome of a ombudsman's decision and say, okay, given this set of facts, we think that this customer, you know, A, is eligible for compensation or not, and B, this would be an appropriate amount. And perhaps allocate that across multiple players. So in the scams life cycle, you know, there could be other organizations that arguably have contributed to a customer's loss as well. So that's a really challenging sort of scenario. Jocelyn, I'm going to start with you. You know, how far off is something like that, do you think? You know, is that just like, you know, dreamland?
No, so I think my answer to that is it kind of depends. So because we know that inside every case or every across every situation, there are increasing levels of complexity. So I think there is kind of a couple of things I'd say is at the very sort of simple end where actually precedent is clear and liability is clear. I think you could do that sooner rather than later. But there will always be a deeply complex end where a customer situation wouldn't be ripe for that. And I think you've just got to be really clear about how you calibrate a model to know when it throws out the different answers. But what I would also say is that presumes, I'm certainly not saying we go from where we are today straight to paying customers automatically based on a model. I do think there is a step through process, and hopefully Dave will think that I have half a clue about how I would implement such a thing, is that you would go through a step through process where you might use it to provide a recommendation that a human would then review and then make a decision off. And certainly that's what I would do as an interim, is I would build a model, get it to allocate, make the decision, but then give that to a human being to review and to then make the final choice of. So see it more as a recommendation from the model rather than as a final decision. That's how I would use it. But I think, ironically, I think in a lot of cases for that first pass recommendation, I would probably find, like, given the complexity, I actually think it's the perfect type of technology to help us get to a first recommendation. But Dave, I don't know, have I, is that the way you would do it? I think we should check in with you.
Yeah, no, I think you're always going to have a human in the loop, right? That's why, for example, on the Microsoft side, I like their branding where they say it's a co-pilot. The intention here is never to replace the human. It's just simply to augment and make the human faster, more effective, right? Instead of the human having to go out and spend a lot of time collecting information and pulling it all together, the AI should be able to come up with a conclusion and come up with all that information and then give it to the human being to check, because it will occasionally get it wrong, right? Again, these tools are stochastic or probabilistic in nature. They're not going to be 100% right all the time. There are ways of training the tools. So as you build this GenAI model, there's this concept of what they refer to as reinforcement learning, where what it will do is make recommendations, and then based on what the human does, whether they accept it or they adjust it, it will then go back and update the model. So the model learns, right? So as the human being is in the loop, the model will get better, and less the human being will have to make changes. But I think you would always, at least in the near future, have some human being in the loop. I think the bigger challenge is going to be to actually figure out what that process is or how you're making a decision. So in GenAI, we have this concept of what we call chain of thought, where you take a complex problem and you break it down into the individual steps or decisions that the human being would make. Like, for example, if it's a scam, what type of scam is it? If it's if it's this particular area, like, what are all the different sub decisions that people have to make before they come to a conclusion about, an assessment around that specific scam? The challenge here will be people actually being able to map that out and get agreement on that. Because in traditional business processes right now, the individual makes a decision. It's usually about the one case, and then you usually evaluate whether that was effective or not retrospectively. Now what you're talking about doing is codifying the process and then having the automation to follow that codification, which will impact thousands of people. So I can see there being really intricate arguments going on in the sector and with the regulators about what is the actual process, what are the steps in that decision, how would you actually break that down? And so I think that will be actually the challenge. I think the technology in some senses is less of a challenge, and it's more the actual business process and that kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? In my view, anyways.
Thanks, Dave. Evelyn, one of the things that sort of comes out of that is that chain of thought that a human, when they analyze a case, some of the references that they're either explicitly or perhaps even unconsciously referring to as they make that decision, it's a combination of data that might be private, the customer's individual scam complaint. It could be proprietary, other scams complaints that your bank has seen before, and some rules and policies that you've developed around how you think they should be handled. Or it could be different shades of public data, a decision by the regulator that's public, or legislation. So there's all these different things that are this frame of reference for making that decision. How do you think you go about trying to establish the boundaries of what the AI should be thinking about? And certainly so that it's not going out and just asking the internet, because as Dave said at the beginning, that might end up with some interesting examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think as with any AI, the data set that you input into it has to be quite tightly confined. I actually think, it's interesting because, as Jocelyn mentioned, scams are one of the most complex type of complaints, and also one of those that turn very much on the individual facts, more so, I would say, than any other kind of banking and finance complaint, which means getting the facts right and interpreting the facts is super important. That may be something AI can really help with. It may be a challenge. But one thing I think AI probably can help with is that you very rarely get all the facts you need in the early stages of a scam complaint. So you very rarely get all the facts from what the customer tells you, or even, from initial kind of investigation within the bank. So that investigation process can be quite long and protracted and can involve quite a lot of back and forth. So to have an AI tool that could assist, whether by itself or, co-piloting, could assist in identifying what are the missing pieces of information that are the most material. I think that is a real life value add that could be delivered. I see Jocelyn nodding, who's really close to the coalface, so that makes me feel happy. But certainly, even from my experience back at AFCA, that is something that would have been equally helpful, because we're all looking at the same kinds of complaints in the same kind of way. I think another complexity about the scams is because we are moving into a new potentially code or regulatory environment, right? And that inherently makes it really tough for AI. It makes it tough for everyone, because you don't have precedent. You don't have established decisions in that framework to fall back on. And the other thing is, the codes are going to be quite principles-based, I suspect, and because you can't regulate for every single circumstance. And so it's not as easy as just say, apply code clause 8 to scenario C, because that in itself will require a significant amount of interpretation. And until we see, for example, how organisations like AFCA approach that, it'll be an evolving perspective. I think it's really interesting as well, even when you just talk about bringing in AFCA decisions, right, which AFCA decisions are published. So there's a, rich source, you'd think. like in the same way that a court judgment is. It's all there. Every decision since 2018 is published. So you've all kinds of different scam scenarios. But one of the interesting aspects to that is decisions only constitute 6 to 8% of the cases that AFCA sees. So 6 to 8% of the complaints go all the way to decision. The remaining over 90% are decided through other processes, whether that's through conciliation, negotiation, through an initial non-binding AFCA recommendation. So all that is actually below the surface, and yet that's a significant bulk of cases. And that's without even looking at cases that are just decided within banks and actually never go to EDR. And out of that, there's also some self-selecting because of AFCA decisions, approximately 80 to 90% go in favour of banks. Not because AFCA takes a view 80 to 90% in favour of banks, but because of the processes and systems, the complaints which are more likely to proceed further are those where banks will win. So that's an interesting bias, right? If ChatGPT was just to look at, or GenAI was just to look at, the AFCA website, it would say, oh, banks win 80 to 90% of the time. The bank has done nothing wrong. Whereas if you actually look underneath at the whole universe of complaints, the proportions may well look quite different. So it's interesting what appears, at first instance to be a really rich source of data, has to be considered with those kind of limitations and qualifications attached.
So this opens up a really interesting point. One of the objectives of a scams or any sort of complaints process is consistency. So, at least within an institution and ideally across institutions, the same customer face or different customers facing essentially the same circumstances should be treated the same way. Now, with this partition of data, that's actually quite complicated, and privacy law might even get in the way. Is there a model out there where, an AI should be actually given a wider space to roam to look for that consistency, but to somehow have the right constraints to protect the data? Dave, is that even technically possible?
Yeah, it's definitely technically possible. I think this is where I think it's so they talk about this idea of the large language model, these really big models like ChatGPT, but what's becoming the recent trend is what they call small language models, where people are building models specifically to specific use cases, either industry specific or, for example, task specific, like customer service, right? So I can see people building models that would specifically handle these types of issues like you guys are talking about. And the banks are probably the first area where people start building their own models, simply because, just the sheer size of the banks, spending a couple $1 million to build a model is probably not a big deal for them, right? But you raise a point. The issue is the data, and getting the data across, maybe multiple organizations will be one of the bigger challenges that people have to sort out. If you can get the right data sets, then you can build a large language model around that data set. Doesn't mean it doesn't preclude it, because even if you don't have complete data set, you can still build the model and then do what they call fine tuning on your own data as well, right? So there are different sort of options now, but I do think that eventually you will see people building these sort of purpose-built tools in this area, and conversations around how do we aggregate this data to build these tools we start coming to the fore.
Great. I'm going to hand over to the Q&A in a moment, but I might just leave Evelyn and Jocelyn with a challenge there, which is, let's see how far you get with that conversation with your privacy lawyers inside the bank or anyone else. Try and learn. I suspect at the moment it might be a fairly brief conversation.
And that's the whole other piece. With we know significant privacy and data collection, etc., reforms, coming down the track, that's going to play into this, in a big way.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so there's a couple of questions just wanted to pick up. One of them was just about the input. So the model that Zoe showed us was based on email. Sometimes the input comes via voice. Obviously AI can listen to a voice, and that's part of what they do. Does that just complicate the risks, or is voice input more or less the same as the input source?
I'm assuming the question is to me.
Sorry, Dave. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look at the issue of voice to text has been around for a long time. The technology is pretty mature now. So doing that translation, there are different things and nuances that you'd have to address, but no, it's a pretty it's pretty well advanced, right? So you can use voice translated into text, then that gets translated into the model. The newer models are actually what they refer to as multimodal. So you can put in images, you can put in text, you can put in voice, and you don't even have to have that translation piece up front. It'll actually just accept that. Do you know what I mean? So the technology, back to, you were making that comment earlier in the session about this idea of nuance, and APRA was making this comment that, the models currently can't handle nuance. You have to be careful saying what they can and can't do, because there's literally thousands of models being created each month. All the major vendors are releasing new versions almost weekly. So the technology is advancing quite significantly. So like I said, this concept of multimodal and using different ways and images and voice and that, it's becoming very, very commonplace now, and the capability is increasing as we speak every day.
Thank you. There's another question here about watermarking, and I'm going to translate this one a little bit. Obviously, in the context of deep fakes, there's a conversation at the moment about whether or not where a artificial intelligence AI has been used to generate a video image or something like that, whether it should be watermarked. I might ask that question, but also let's take it a little bit further, which is if an AI is involved in making a decision, should the customer be informed of that fact? Do banks need to develop an AI policy similar to a privacy policy that they're going to be putting out available so people can know what those boundaries are? Or do we leave it to the black box and see what comes out of it? Jocelyn, can I start with you on your thoughts?
I think, as always, it will depend on how you're using it. And it depends on the tools that you're using. So I'm the wrong person to ask. Evelyn's going to give you a better answer on this from a legal standpoint. But personally, I wouldn't, because I actually think it's no different to, would I use a human, like 7 different people in a process, and one person is doing investigation and somebody else is making a decision. Kind of, we're just using AI as a component part of the process. But I think there is a difference between when it's part of a process that is basically augmenting a decision that a human makes, versus if it was making the decision 100% itself and there was no human involved. I think I would have a different view on that. But this is not my area of specialty. This is what I would normally, this is the joy of working for a large organization, where you can defer that to other parts of the organization who are much better at than you are. So I'm going to have to take that, call a friend, and defer to Evelyn on that one.
All right, thanks. Evelyn?
So I think it's interesting, because there is kind of a long-standing, I don't want to say tradition, convention, common law, natural justice type aspect in EDR, which relates to having your complaint, grievance, whatever it is, resolved by an identified decision maker. And that's quite interesting. And certainly, when I was at AFCA, that was why the decision maker signed the decision in their personal capacity with their name attached, because that has been, historically an important aspect. Whether that should still apply is open to question, right? Because you're really acting as an organ of the organisation. So whether that's appropriate, but beyond that, I think. I think this discussion around transparency and around disclosing when AI is being used is part of the broader conversation. And I think, to some of the earlier points, consumers, it's one of those areas where consumers know they should be worried, but they're not quite sure how worried they should be and exactly what about. And that's where I think this conversation is important, because you don't want to get to the point where there's widespread use of AI and customers, rightly or wrongly, feel or perceive that it's not transparent and that they've been in some way deceived or manipulated. I think it's not so much about how it's used, it's also about people actually understanding and being aware of how it's used, to making sure we're bringing the community along with us, as we explore these use cases.
Yeah, thanks. Well, Dave,
I was going to say, I think it depends. Interestingly enough, I think different jurisdictions have taken different approaches. People ask about watermarking specifically because when the Biden executive order came out last year, it mandated watermarking, right? So that was something that in the US they're expecting. The EU approach is more nuanced, and I actually think is more interesting, and they're asking the right questions. So even before the AI regulation that they recently came out with, the GDPR mandated something related to right to non-discriminate and right to explain. And so it's not necessarily, in my head, it's not necessarily whether the AI are using automation, it's whether you can prove to the individual that they haven't been discriminated against, and you can actually explain to them how the decision was made, right? If you can do both those things, then I think people are a little bit more accepting, regardless of whether you've used audit, because they're expecting you as an organization to have some form of automation. In fact, they probably wouldn't mind it if it's going to make the process faster for them, but they want to know, how did you make that decision? That's because they want to be able to dispute it, and they also want to be able to say, you know, did you not discriminate against me because of my ethnicity or where I live or whatever, right? So I think that's the more important question to ask around the process. But anyways.
Yeah, and I think I also think it's really interesting because I think images are different to kind of this kind of process. And so I do think they're two different questions. And I'm a photographer personally. And if I think about all this conversation about splicing images together and generating it, actually photographers have been putting images together ever since photography started. So you just put two, like, you know, there's plenty of images that we would think of all of a sudden there's a moon in an image, and so, well, actually they're two different plates put together. I hate to tell people this, but even Ansel Adams did it too. But so it just depends on what. It also goes back, I think, to what you think the image actually is, what the purpose of the image is. And there is a difference, I absolutely agree, between something that's being used as a proof of something versus something that is a creative process. So I think we also have to understand and go back to what is the intent of and what is the use of the thing as well.
I think there's also a really interesting question, right? Because you're not starting, when people talk about bias and inaccuracy, obviously you're not comparing it to a zero, you know. We know that in human processes there is bias and inaccuracy. But I do ask myself quite often, you know, would consumers prefer to have a human who is going to be a bit more wrong, or an AI who's going to be a bit more right? And I think views may differ quite widely on that. So it's an interesting question.
And can I make a comment on the one about bias? And
Yeah,
I say this because it was part of the research I did when I did my PhD. I can engineer bias out of a machine. I can't engineer it out of a person. And human beings, even if they tried hard not to be, will still be biased in terms of how they make decisions, right? So I think ultimately, you know, not just because I'm a technologist, but I just feel that because you can engineer it out of the machine, it's probably going to be a better process longer term.
I might thank you. That's actually a really great place to bring the conversation to a close. We are just about to run out of time. For those who've asked questions that haven't been answered, what we will do is capture all of those questions and try to come back to you with a response. If necessary, we'll reach out to some of the experts here on the panel to put that together. First of all, I just want to thank Dave, Jocelyn and Evelyn for your time and your insights today. This is a really rich and fascinating conversation, and exactly what I hoped might happen today, which was really explored some of those deeper challenges about how to make the best use of this technology over the next little while. Hopefully people on board the session have at least walked away from here with some good questions to ask, which is probably where we're at the moment. I don't think there are many clear answers just yet, but there are some obvious questions, and maybe that's the main takeaway from today is, you know, if you are contemplating doing some work in this space, what are the questions to ask and answer before you move ahead too far? Slightly different scenario, but you know, the country saw robo-debt 5 or 6 years ago, and perhaps some of those questions, or some of the questions we've identified today, should have been asked back then. Right? Just in terms of a few other comments before we wrap up, David and Zoe and the IBM team are available to answer any other questions that people might like, or if you'd like to organise a version of this presentation for your teams, they're happy to do that. So either find them on LinkedIn, or through the ABA we can introduce them to you if you would like. So that's just as a follow-up to the session. Also, just noting that the ABA Banking Conference is coming up fairly shortly. This topic, AI, along with another number of other sort of hot topics in the banking space, are on the agenda. If you are thinking about coming and haven't bought a ticket, the details are on screen there as to how you might want to come along. On that note, with 2 minutes to spare, I would like to finish up for today. Just repeat my thanks to all our presenters, Dave, Zoe, Jocelyn and Evelyn, and look forward to seeing some of you at least on further iterations of these sort of seminars as we explore other issues of interest to banks. So thank you all, wishing you all a great day. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.